Well, hello church, good to be with you on a very, very special day. I don't know if you realise what day it is, but let me try and explain. All around the world, Jews are busy celebrating the festival and the feast of Purim. Now, the feast of Purim goes back to the book of Esther, which commands that it's celebrated on the 14th to the 15th day of Adar. Now, the way that Jewish calendar works, it falls usually between February and March. Today, it actually falls in February to the 25th, today's date. And so today and tomorrow, the Jews will be having this unique celebration, and I thought it would be a great idea to sort of tune into the thinking that's going on and try and understand the importance of the Feast of Purim. For Christians, it's really worth remembering that Jesus would have celebrated this feast day. Now, a feast day is interesting. We understand fasting, but feasting actually is the direct opposite. And on a feast day, no mourning is allowed. No sadness is allowed. In fact, it's a day when you are encouraged to eat too much. And in fact, the one day of the year, or the 2 days of the year, this one festival, are the days when Jews were actually encouraged to drink too much. Now, I'm not suggesting that we do that. We're not keeping Jewish law, but just of interest. And I'm sure Jesus, as a child at least, and probably there's a hint in John's Gospel, as an adult, that he celebrated this feast too. When Jesus was young, Mary and Joseph would have made sure that Jesus kept all of the Jewish customs. So what did that mean as a child? Well, as a child, you would have dressed up. You would have dressed up in costume, and you would have been taking gifts and pastries to people. You'd have been given alms to the poor. And it was a celebration of that most important time when the Jews were nearly wiped out, but not because of God's intervention. It's one of those two celebrations, actually, that the Jews keep, which isn't found in the law of Moses because it happened in subsequent events. The other one's Hanukkah, which when 165 years before the birth of Jesus, there was a rebellion against the Syrian oppressors, and the Jews were liberated. And Jesus has, celebrated Hanukkah, and he would have celebrated Purim as well. And as I said, there are strands in the Gospels that we can pick up to show some of that. But that's for another time. So, why was it particularly important at the time of Jesus? Well, you've got to remember that when he was about 8 years old, the Romans invaded the land. And that was a big deal. Purim was a time when they celebrated the delivery of the Jewish people out of the hands of the Persian Empire and the Prime Minister of the Persian Empire who was plotting to kill them. It may figure in John 5 at the minor festival when Jesus goes to Jerusalem before the events of the Pool of Siloam. Haman, the Prime Minister of the Persians, tried to wipe out all of the Jews in the book of Esther. And what I want to try and do is, over the next few days, on a morning, I'm going to take over from Luke for a week, give him a bit of a rest, and see if we can explore together some of the events in the book of Esther that mightn't be particularly apparent, and go through and see some of those things that are there, but sometimes glossed over. Today, literally today, in Israel, there will be people walking around in fancy dress because that's the way that you did it. People will be dressed up as Mordecai or Haman or Esther, but they might also be dressed as modern day anti-Semitics. And so if you go on the streets of Jerusalem, if COVID allows, you will find people walking around in Saddam Hussein masks and costumes. You'll be finding people in Yasser Arafat costumes, because they don't just celebrate the Esther delivery of the people, they celebrate the delivery of the Jewish people right through time. So what would happen on the day? First thing, a Jewish person would go to the synagogue for the reading of the Megillah, that is the scroll of Esther. And when the cantor, the leader of the ceremony, if you like, inside the synagogue, comes to the story, they read right through the entire book. When they come to the name of Mordecai, the good guy in the story, all the people have to shout, "Blessed be Mordecai!" And when the name Haman, the villain, is read, everybody stamps their feet on the floor and makes a noise with noisemakers called groggers, like football rattles. And they shout, "Cursed be Haman!" The rabbis say that a man should mellow himself with wine at Purim until he cannot tell the difference between "Cursed be Haman" and "Blessed be Mordecai." In other words, get so drunk they're incapable of understanding what has been said. Now, as I say, we're not encouraging that. But that's what will be going on today, all across the world. And children in those costumes will parade around the streets. It's a sort of, how shall I put it, like a Jewish pantomime mixed with Halloween and mixed with New Year's, all rolled into one, but without the occult overtones, of course. So Jesus as a child, we don't know much about Jesus other than the fact he kept the festivals and feasts. We remember him being taken to the temple at 12-year-old. And I'm sure Mary and Joseph were so deeply committed to the education of Jesus that he would have taken part in everything that was part of the Jewish culture that a good Jew should experience. So I don't know, I've got this mental image of a young Jesus at 7-year-old running around the streets and taking pastries. They used to call these pastries Haman's ears because they're triangular and filled with all sorts of stuffing. And it's sort of like, you know, a joke, Haman's ears anyhow. If you ever hear somebody talking about that, the pastries, don't panic. But when Jesus went to Jerusalem for this feast, I'm sure he would have attended the reading of the scroll of Esther in one of the 480 synagogues that were in Jerusalem. At that time did he stomp his feet and say, "Blessed be Mordecai, cursed be Haman"? I don't know. What I am certain about is this. He would have contemplated the message of the book of Esther. The theme, the great theme of the book of Esther is this: God preserves even his unbelieving people. Now, it wasn't just Esther's story, it's Mordecai's too. If he hadn't been prepared to act, that would have been it for the Jews. Just before we turn our attention to what it actually says, let me tell you one little story. Adolf Hitler knew about this holiday and its significance to the Jewish people. In 1941, he banned the Jewish community in Poland from the observation of Purim, and they were forbidden to read the scroll of Esther, and the synagogues were closed on that day. It's said that very early in the career of Hitler after World War I, when he's starting to rabble-rouse, he was given a fiery speech in a large hall in Munich. And during this oration, he called for the destruction of the Jewish people. In the front row, there was a man who sat there listening, and on occasion he'd make faces and he would laugh at the Führer. And after the meeting, as you might imagine, Hitler inquired as to who the man was, why he made faces, and why he laughed at them. The man explained he was Jewish, and he said to Hitler, "You should be aware that you're not the first anti-Semite who's tried to destroy us. You might recall that the great Pharaoh of Egypt sought to enslave the Jews. To commemorate his defeat and our redemption, we eat tasty matzah and observe the festival of Passover. Haman was another enemy of ours," he said to Hitler, "who brought about his own downfall. The delicious Haman's ears we eat, and the jolly festival of Purim recall our deliverance from him." While I was listening to you, I wondered what type of delicacy us Jews would invent and what kind of holiday would be established to celebrate your downfall. Well, the subsequent events were so terrible and so dire. They never decided to eat a celebratory food or to have a festival or feast. But instead the Jews do commemorate the downfall of Hitler. And they remember, of course, the Holocaust. And Holocaust memorably on the 27th of Nisan. And many Jews fast on this day. Okay, let's turn to the book of Esther. What I'd like you to do is read for yourself. I was going to read them to you, but it takes too long for me to read out loud. So if you would, please, read a chapter a day or 2 chapters a day would be perfect. So we're starting to look at Esther. And let me just tell you what the theme really comes out here. It's a unique book, first of all, because God isn't mentioned once. And yet, rabbis say outside of the Torah, the books of the law, this is the most important scripture in the Old Testament. Well, it's about somebody who starts in an insignificant way and for most of their lives was powerless and caught up in the most amazing circumstances. I don't know if sometimes you feel that life happens to you rather than you have an impact on life. And sometimes too, God doesn't seem to figure in what's happening outside church or outside of our daily devotions. Sometimes life does feel like a bit of a bubble, a spiritual bubble. And there's no connect between the two, what happens in church and what happens in devotions in real life. I suppose that's what it must have been like for someone like this girl called Hadassah. For her, life was tough and dangerous. Her family was one of those dragged off to slavery into Babylon. Later, her mother and father die, and she's brought up by her uncle. We don't know how old she was, but I'm sure she was young. Then an even bigger upheaval because the Babylonians are conquered by the Persians. And of course we read about some of these characters in other books of the Bible. Because in the book of Daniel we read about that incredible feast when the moving finger wrote on the wall and said, weighed, and divided, and judged, and mene, tekel, upharsin. And that very night, Cyrus the Persian conquered Babylon. And he becomes a leading character in the book of Daniel. And then eventually he actually, no doubt because of Daniel's favour, gives the command that the Jews can go back again to Israel, and he sets them free. Not for Mordecai or Esther. They stay in Persia when they could have gone home. Not a good move. We read about Cyrus's son who takes over, Darius, because he's the king involved in the story of Daniel and the lion's den. And then we come to his son in turn, who the Bible calls Ahasuerus, but history records as Xerxes the First. It's strange when we look at Mordecai and Esther because clearly they've got Babylonian foreign names. Mordecai is derivative of Marduk, the Babylonian god. And Esther, Hadassah, is clearly named after Ishtar, the female goddess of the Babylonians. And so Mordecai is in Susa, in this capital of Persia, when he should have been back in Jerusalem. Well, this king who's in charge, when it starts in the book of Esther, you're going to read at the very beginning that he is throwing a huge celebration for all the province governors, and he brings them all together. Now, let me just explain. Darius's father, the king that was involved in Daniel and the lion's den, was the first of the Persian kings who tried to invade Greece. That's interesting, because we read about him as well in the pages of history. It says that at this beginning of his reign, he consulted all of these provinces. Now, the story of Queen Vashti comes into it, and we'll pick up on Queen Vashti tomorrow. But what's important to understand is that Xerxes is about to invade Greece as well. If you look in chapter 1, it will talk in chapter 2, it talks about Esther being recruited to the harem. In other words, she was recruited to be a sex slave for the king. I've heard all sorts of preachers talk about as if she's honoured and sort of like, I don't know, anyhow. Let's not gloss over what was really going on. But she doesn't go in to sleep with Xerxes until the 7th year of his reign. And you might ask, why is that? Why is there this gap between the two? The answer is quite simple. Xerxes was the next emperor of Persia who tried to invade Greece and yet again leaps from the pages of history. Because if you look at it, you will find that he is the Persian king that is defeated by the 300 Spartans at the pass of Thermopylae. And then the Athenian army joins in as well after the valiant attempts of these 300 Spartans hold them off. And later at the Battle of Salamis, he is defeated. It's only then that he goes back again to Persia. And we pick up the story again when Xerxes is prevailed upon from his prime minister, but later from Esther, to decide the fate of the Jews entirely around the world. The penalty is, you will see when you read it, for walking into the king uninvited, the penalty is death. If life is tough for a captive slave girl living in a foreign country, it's about to get far much more dangerous. Just to finish, let me just say this. Sometimes we try to understand our life in the here and now. Yet the picture of who we are and the path that God has called us to walk is often only seen in hindsight or much later in our lives. Like Moses, you might not know the part you will play in this life, and sometime you have to wait for the right time, and it was 80-year-old before that plan started to unfold. Hadassah, Esther, doesn't know the strange path that she will walk. In case we don't recognize her, we will meet her again. As I say, Hadassah is named after the goddess Ishtar, and from now on we will call her by how she's referred to in the story. That is Esther. Have a read of it. God be with you, and God bless you. Amen.